Hello and welcome to Mythic Mind Movies and Shows, where we discuss movies and shows from a broad-scale Christian humanities framework. I'm Dr. Andrew Snyder, and I'm glad that you're here. All right, welcome back as we continue our Star Wars series, now moving on to the prequels with the Phantom Menace. Now, before we get into the conversation, I should mention who's here. We've got Reverend David, we've got Layman David, we've got Daylon, we've got Ian, and we have Judah, who he's been on the main Mythic Mind podcast a couple times, been featured over there. First time over here. And so, Judah, why don't you just tell us a little bit about who you are and what brings you to this conversation?
Oh man, it's good question here. I've been with the Mythic Mind group pretty much since it started. Got connected with that via Twitter, when it was still called Twitter, actually. So I've been kind of lurking in the background for a little bit these days. I helped, not so much anymore, but when it got started, I helped Andrew do the administration of the server a lot more, which was really fun to do. I have college education in humanities, so kind of naturally fell into this group. I also have some studies in government, and maybe that'll come into play as we discuss the prequels, since Star Wars suddenly has real politics. So that's kind of neat. I'm in this group today discussing the prequels because I actually have a lot more thoughts on them than the original trilogy. I think they're a lot more interesting in some ways, and particularly with the world building. So I'm hoping that we get to discuss that. Before we officially started the recording, we were discussing whether we would all be negative or not. But I will say I'm not someone who is all negative on these. So hopefully I'll be able to bring a positive perspective, even if I'm the only one.
I appreciate that. Now, you saying that you've been lurking in the background. I mean, is that a Phantom Menace kind of lead up? I mean, it's a good framing there.
I guess it could be, yes. Maybe I'm the Sith of this group. I don't know.
Finally
No,
revealed.
I'm the Sith of this group.
That's actually most likely.
There's always two, so.
Yeah, seeing as on the other podcast recently, Ian said he's totally fine with genocide, but I won't provide any context for that. I'm just going to let that land where it is.
No. Those are in the next couple of movies, the genocide. It hasn't started yet.
All right. Well, yeah, so we'll begin as we usually do. Just say something about your experience with this movie, or general thoughts, kind of wherever you want to lead off, and we'll take it from there. I'll start us off this time. In my reckoning, this is definitely the biggest step we've had so far in the long defeat of Star Wars. I know we talked about trying to do positive versus negative spin here. And don't get me wrong, I liked the prequels when I first saw them. I mean, I was a young kid. I wasn't really criticizing movies. Star Wars is cool. And then, of course, as I got a little bit older, a little bit more cynical, I kind of fell into the group think of, yeah, they're not worth viewing. But in my recent rewatch, I've decided that there actually is some good stuff going on there. However, for me, what causes such a categorical difference between these trilogies, as well as what comes after that, is that the original trilogy is such an archetypal story, fairy tale, really. I mean, that's why the whole franchise begins, a long, long time ago, once upon a time. And I feel like that fairy tale element is most seen in the original trilogy, where it's not just things happening, but it's just the story of the hero's journey, right? Classically, that's kind of how that's framed. That Lucas himself is very clear about that. You have somebody being ripped away from his home, this hometown boy who kind of environmentally is meant to be a hometown boy. I mean, he's the Bilbo of sorts, who then gets ripped off on this adventure with this wizard who, then leads him off and then leaves him. And he has to find his way. And eventually he has to sort of discover that adventurous blood that's running within him. But he has to, redeem it by going into the underworld, so to speak, into the belly of the beast. And so there's so many like mythological and fairy tale and psychological elements built into that trilogy. Whereas now that we're moving into the prequels, as Judah said, we're getting a lot more political, which has a natural appeal to a lot of people. And I think that there's some significant stuff going on there. But I think that's why these movies don't stick with me quite as much, in that they're not, I would say, universal tales like the original trilogy. It's more of like history, which is particular, even though there's surely some universal principles we can extract from that. So that's kind of my way of coming into this, in that I'm not overly, I would say, positive. I try not to be overly negative, but I feel like it is a step down in my reckoning. But as I say that, I want to bring it right over to Judah. Give us your thoughts here. Maybe you can you can bring balance to the force here.
Uh-oh, Bounce to the Force. That's a big deal, and it didn't work out so well for that character. But we're not there yet. I would say I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I like the comparison of saying the original trilogy is a much more universal story, and the prequel trilogy is particular and historical. I think that's a really good way to put it. My interest in the prequel trilogies and why I find them particularly interesting, and I should explain a little bit with what my experience with the Star Wars series is. I didn't end up watching any of the movies until I was an adult, but growing up in the early 2000s, kind of absorbed a lot of stuff about Star Wars by osmosis, so to speak. And when I ended up watching the movies myself when I was older, I realized that tons and tons of like the actual lore of Star Wars comes from the prequel trilogy, and without that, you're really missing a lot of the rest of the galaxy. Really, like the original trilogy doesn't really take place in that many locations, and frankly, a lot of the locations could all be on one planet, because the one planet we're familiar with has like every Star Wars biome in the original trilogy. But most people, when they think of the Star Wars universe, they would come back to the lore that's laid out in the prequel trilogy. So I think, in my opinion, the prequels turn Star Wars from just a story about a solar system into a story about an actual galaxy. And that's where I think a lot of the value is. And I think that fits really well with what you're saying about the prequel trilogy being history, because it does fill out that world building aspect that the original trilogy lacks. And also, I think George Lucas actually had a plan when he made these movies, because we avoid some of the really weird plot holes that the original trilogy has as it proceeds. So there's that too.
Yeah, there definitely is a lot more world building, and I mentioned this in some of our previous conversations that Lucas was very intentional that he wanted to begin in the middle of the story, essentially, right? With what would pretty quickly be called Episode 4, because he didn't want to spend a lot of time initially with world building. He wanted to just throw us into the story and really make it a character-driven story, right? And that's part of this big difference between the sort of existential fairy tale and the history. That the first trilogy is very character driven, is focused on what's happening within Luke Skywalker in particular, and the supporting cast really serves that end in ways that can really be mapped out according to like Carl Jung's archetypes, as that goes through Joseph Campbell and then to George Lucas. And so it's very much an existential, character-driven story, whereas now we're getting more political, and that's naturally going to lead to a broadening of scope away from the individual to the various moving parts. Um, yeah, and so I think that's a good framing of some major differences here. All right, Ian, tell us something about this movie.
Um, I saw it first when I was about 12 or 13, and I do think it is an an evident step down in execution in terms of the writing and character work. I think they got some actors who I would say are probably better actors than the original trilogy in terms of their career and the varieties. I mean, a lot of the actors have won Oscars, like Ewan McGregor and Liam Neeson, I think, have won or been nominated for many awards since they did Star Wars. Um, but they're not challenged as much as I think they could be by the script or direction. I'm curious. When I first watched it, I wasn't really attuned to these things, so I thought that Qui-Gon was supposed to be kind of representative. And I wonder how much the idea of Qui-Gon as a maverick is contained within the actual text of the film and how much is from the expanded universe books I've read about him. Because I like the idea of Qui-Gon as a maverick who has what I would argue are more Christian or more Augustinian interpretations of the Force. But I'm not sure how much of that I'm importing from these other books I've mentioned in previous podcasts. Um, I do really love just the polish of the lightsaber fight in the end, and the music, the incorporation of the choral element into Duel of the Fates by John Williams. I think both of those are really standout things that have added a lot to Star Wars as a whole.
Yeah, and I'm sure that we'll spend some time talking about Qui-Gon. I think he's one of the most interesting figures in this movie. Maybe I'll hold that for now. We'll circle back around to that. All right, David.
Which one?
Oh, sorry, Lady David.
Okay. Yeah, yeah, Ian, of course, you got to stop letting him speak before me. I want him to be on the back foot at some point in these discussions. But yeah, so when Return of the Jedi came out in 1983, I was 9. And so by the time the Phantom Menace came out, I'd spent nearly 2/3 of my life without a new Star Wars movie. I mean, Star Wars never really disappeared. It was all comics and novels and video games that took place mostly in the timeline of the original trilogy or shortly thereafter. So the hype for episode one was huge. And when the trailer came out, I worked at a local like computer shop and internet service provider at the time. And when the trailer came out, all the guys that I worked with, they were just, watching the trailer over and over and pausing and analyzing every little detail and everything. And then the movie came out, and apart from Qui-Gon dying and Darth Maul getting cut in half, like the trailer had basically spoiled the whole story. Like there was way too much revealed in that original trailer. But I don't know. I just nearly everyone is super serious in this movie all the time, and the I feel like the story just kind of moves. I don't want to say soullessly because that seems a little cruel, but like just from one scene to the next, and there's not much that's very fun or engaging, no engaging character development really. And the only character who seems to be allowed to really even attempt humor is this annoying Rastafarian stereotype of a frog man who none of the characters in the movie even like at all, So it's really weird. Like George Lucas was hanging everything on this Jar Jar character. And there's a famous like behind the scenes clip of Lucas going, Jar Jar's the key. We got to get Jar Jar right. He's the key to everything. And I think that's one of the places where he really went wrong. But yeah, and like Ian said, he managed to hire all kinds of famous world-class actors, and he directed them in such a way that it really wasted their talent. And I mean, he hired Samuel Jackson, and he doesn't do anything but sit in a chair, and he delivers a couple of lines, which are in the trailer. And then he cuts concerned looks at the other members of the Jedi Council, and that's basically his whole part in the movie. But I again, yeah, it's not all bad. I do honestly enjoy it, and I think the art direction is brilliant, with the exception of the freaky Yoda puppet with sideburns, which they have replaced in every subsequent version of the film. He's now computer animated. You have to go to YouTube to remember what that puppet looked like. Um, but yeah, the pre-Empire Galaxy looks all clean and polished, which I think is a really good juxtaposition to what we have later as the Empire is taken over and the grimy, gritty kind of way that the universe is presented. I think the pod race is a lot of fun, and like Ian said, the climactic lightsaber sequence is probably the best in the whole series. But my main concern is that the only characters that I thought were really very interesting, Qui-Gon Jinn and Darth Maul, are both killed at the end of this first in this trilogy, the first movie. And I think everyone was really hyped for Darth Maul to be this trilogy's Vader, and killing him off in the first film was really disappointing to the fans. But yeah, I'm interested to hear what other people think they can get out of these philosophically, because to me it's just kind of a straightforward presentation of the political machinations of Palpatine, making himself the Supreme Chancellor. So,
It's a little disappointing. I was counting on you guys to bring out the philosophy on this one, because I mostly agree with that. That it's pretty straightforward. You know essentially what's going to happen. Um, it kind of feels to me like Darth Maul. I mean, I know that they like resurrected him and other things, and I mean, obviously he was supposed to die in the first movie. Like that's obvious, and then they just decided to retcon that. Um, and he kind of has a role that analogous to what we said about Boba Fett in that he's all vibes. Like he doesn't really like minimal speech. What's he have like two lines in the movie,
right,
and like so he doesn't really have any character. He just looks really cool, and it's the first time we see the double lightsaber, and so that was a cool reveal. And so he's a cool character, but yeah, he gets cut in half, and so that's the end of that. Or at least it should have been.
right. Yeah, that's a funny thing that sometimes happens in fiction is you don't realize who's going to be so popular. I mean, this is a weird aside, but like in the old animated Transformers show, they wanted to kill everybody off. And I love the animated Transformers movie. If you haven't seen it from 1985, it's an amazing movie. Uh, but they killed off all of the old characters because they wanted to sell new toys with new characters, and it went so poorly that they had to, just like Darth Maul, find a way to bring Optimus Prime back from the dead because people loved him so much.
Yeah, it is kind of funny how the market can play into creative decision making, which I think leads some questions about the art, if that's the way that
True.
if it's being democratically created.
Right.
Yeah, interesting. All right, Daylon, can you tell us something about this movie?
Yeah, so I'll start with my personal experience with this movie is I was under 10 when it came out, and I'm fairly certain that this movie was the first movie I saw in theaters. And as a child, like seeing a movie in theaters for the first time, like I maybe saw one movie before this. I can't quite tell, all my memories from back then are kind of jumbled. But the set pieces for this movie, I remember being blown away by the pod race, by the lightsaber fights, especially the moment right at the start of Duel of the Fates, where Darth Maul ignites the one lightsaber blade and then the second lightsaber blade, just absolutely insane for a kid that loves sword fighting and Star Wars and lightsabers. Like that was so cool. Um, I will say, even as a kid, though, I think maybe just because like we were talking about earlier, the original trilogy just has more depth to it. I think I was still drawn to those movies more than the prequels, because even when we had them on VHS, I feel like we were still watching the original trilogy more often than we were these prequels, even though the special effects were obviously more advanced. Um, and so I think that does speak to the fact that there is more staying power to those movies. On rewatching, um, the episode one here recently, I think that the set pieces still do hold up for the most part. Like the pod race is still a very um for anyone who's any sort of a sports fan or a race fan, like it still manages to deliver on that type of action. The first lightsaber fight with Darth Maul on Tatooine works pretty well, and then obviously the fight between Darth Maul and Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan is the highlight of the entire movie. Um, Other than that, though, I think the weaknesses of Lucas as a dialogue writer and a director really do um, kind of shine in this movie, unfortunately. I think there's a lot of things here that really I can credit for exposing me to the idea of sci-fi as more than just vibes. Like sci-fi can be, a universe with political machinations and with a more realistic universe where there are things going on besides just, lightsaber goes brr. Um, I don't think the execution was very good, but I think that it does a good job of kind of introducing the concept of, maybe a more political science fiction story to an audience that may never have been exposed to that before. So I'll credit it with that.
Yeah, I mean, kind of echoing that. as well as what others have said, it is aesthetically interesting. I think that you know, as David said, that it's you don't get the grime of the imperial galaxy, and so there is something engaging about that. But as you said, I mean, philosophically, it's just, I don't know how much to pull from that. Although I mean, the pod racing did make for a good N64 game, so that was cool. All right. Reverend David, tell us something about this movie.
Um, all right. Uh, where do I go? You bring up the N64 game. I love the sequel far more than I think anybody else does, because everybody will just talk about Star Wars Racer. I loved Racer Revenge far more personally, and probably destroyed that disc with how often I played that game. But Ian brought a prop last time. My only surviving episode one toy from when I was 9. Um, Felt like I had all those toys. But anyways, um, being a guy that loves sword fighting, of course I'm gonna go there myself. Uh, um, I want to make a comment that my dad made about watching the fight scene from Return of the Jedi, actually, because I think it applies to all of the big prequel fights. My dad studied martial arts, and when he saw Luke charge after Vader after he makes the comment about Leia turning, my dad goes, if you go into a fight emotional or angry, you leave yourself massively vulnerable. And this is what happens to Obi-Wan after Qui-Gon dies. He gets all emotional, he's now angry, and at first it actually gives him an advantage. And he really gets Maul on the back foot. But eventually it causes himself to be left vulnerable, and this allows Maul to throw him down the pit. Now, of course, we all know that Maul loses this fight because we get a little preview of what will happen to Anakin later. And I appreciate that there are these like little moments that Lucas puts in the first two prequel movies to kind of set up how exactly Anakin falls. Now, you talk, David brought up the fact that there's not much in the way of philosophy, and I would say I would largely agree with that, but there are like little, like shallow moments that can get us to think about certain things. One thing my wife and I were talking about, we just rewatched it last night, um, is that basically, we understand that Qui-Gon pretty much knew that Anakin was going to win the pod, and yet he bets heavily on it. And even Watto himself, like, alludes to the fact that he gets kind of swindled. So, you know, I guess maybe more morally than philosophically, was Qui-Gon right to, bet as heavily as he did? Now, bringing in a little bit of the mythology, the Force could have revealed the likeliness of Anakin winning as a means to free Anakin to thus do the Force's will. And so, was Qui-Gon completely wrong um, in doing that? There was one other big thing my wife and I were talking about, and it's escaping me off the top of my head. But
Oh, Anakin staying in the cockpit.
yeah, okay. She's right next to me. Anakin staying in the cockpit, during all of the end fighting. I mean, technically, he listened to Qui-Gon's orders. He stayed in the cockpit, but of course, he still breaks the rule by leaving the hangar. And we look at this. Okay, that's a wrong action, but it was kind of the will of the Force for that to happen because a lot of the plan falls apart if he doesn't destroy that control ship because the Trade Federation left the front door open. Um, um, what else? Yeah, I mean John Williams' score throughout the entirety of the movie is just wonderful. At one point, I could quote every line of this movie. Little flex, not anymore, but I used to. Um, but yeah, those are my thoughts.
Yeah, as you rehash some of that, especially with the pod racing and the betting and whatnot, I can't help but to have the Weird Al song running through my head, which I mean, personally, I think is at least as good as this entire movie. But anyways, I mean, I think that honestly, the answer to both of those issues is Providence, the Force, that things happen as they're supposed to. Did Qui-Gon have a unfair advantage in the gambling? Of course he did. He even moves the die at one point with the Force, and so he would have done great at Vegas. But in this scenario, he's obviously not going out for personal enrichment or anything. Like he knows that this boy's special. He needs to be freed. He's using what's at his disposal here. I don't see anything distinctly unethical about it from my outlook. I don't know if anyone wants to disagree with me on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that honestly to me is one of the more morally interesting things about the movie is there's clearly this idea of the will of the Force directing things, and yet all the characters, or at least our heroes, are taking action to make that happen. Like, I do have some moral qualms with Qui-Gon trying to use the Force to convince Watto to sell him stuff for cheaper, or um, with a chance cube, I'm not as big of detractor there because I think it's a novelization, they talk about how Watto actually weighted that chance cube to always land on the other one, and so Qui-Gon was just leveling it out. Um,
Well, and also he was trying to free a slave, and so I feel like manipulating a slaver to free a slave is similar to the Hebrew midwives lying to Pharaoh's executioners about killing Hebrew babies.
yeah. But I do think that, yeah, Qui-Gon trusts in the will of the Force, but he's also taking action to make sure that that happens. And that I think that really does speak to the idea of, yes, there is, God's providence. And yet, Christians aren't called to just sit and let the world idly go by and say, like, well, it's God's will, but like God has called us to be doing things.
Right. And it's not even just a slave, it's an immaculately conceived slave, right? We should yeah, I when Reverend David was talking about him staying in the cockpit and the the will of the Force and providence and whatnot, it did remind me, I believe it was a Lewis quote about that God will use our actions. It's just, will they be in the way that he used Judas's actions or John's actions? It's something like that, I believe.
Yeah, that God's, I can't remember the exact quote, but that's the gist of it. Yeah, so either way, you're going to serve God's purposes. This is up to you to decide what that's going to be. That you need to make your calling and election sure. Scripture tells us. Which, I mean, obviously we don't call and elect ourselves, but we do live as if we are called and elect, and thereby reveal our calling and election. And so, yes, there's providence, but also we don't know what providence is, so we act as if Providence is moving in a certain direction, and thereby we reveal it to be doing as such. And so, yeah, they have to take action, but at the same time, we see how all these things are being moved kind of behind the scenes. Um, Now, unfortunately, I think we do need to talk a little bit about what they do to the Force starting in this movie. The midichlorian. Is anybody like pro midichlorian here? No, okay. Um, which is it's such a shame that, I mean, I don't know how much it really matters because I don't, if I recall correctly, it doesn't really play a significant role moving forward. I don't remember them ever being mentioned after episode one. I could be wrong about that. Um, but in the attempt to take this the mystery that the mystery behind Star Wars, the ultimate mystery, like what is this thing that holds everything together, and then to make it biological, like that just we lose. I don't know the metaphysics, right? It kind of it becomes physical. So I don't really know what the thought behind that was. I don't know what that discussion looked like where they thought this would be a good idea. But yeah, I don't know if anyone has any other comments to say on that.
I
Yeah,
mean, to
that's.
me,
Oh,
go
go
ahead.
ahead, Ian.
You do it there first this time, David.
Oh no, it's just Obi-Wan even says like even Master Yoda doesn't have a midichlorian count that high. And yeah, that takes away the, it's do or do not. Well, it's easy for you to say, Yoda, you got a huge midichlorian count, which just I agree, Andrew, that sort of just cuts the legs up from underneath it.
Yeah, sort of building off that, I think that it serves a really clunky writing purpose, which is this proves Anakin is special. I don't think you need that. I think Obi-Wan could have just, quoting Darth Vader, the force is strong in this one. That's all we would need, right? I feel like that would be fine.
Especially since we all knew who Anakin is and who he would be. Like we know he's special like, going into it. That's one advantage of doing prequels that you don't have to establish these things that the audience already knows. So I see no upside.
Yeah. I do want to talk a lot about that scene where Anakin talks to the council, because that's where we get a lot of um I would say new ideas introduced about the force. We have the idea of balance of the force woven throughout with Qui-Gon and the prophecy. We have Yoda's speech about fear, anger, suffering, the dark side. Um, where do you guys sit on how this scene affects your understanding of the force and our Christian interaction with the force, um, as a philosophical religious concept?
It's a really good thing to bring up, though, because that is a great little sermonette that Yoda gives there about fear is a path to the dark side, fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering. I do think um, that is a bit of a Christian idea. Like fear is a lack of faith. Um, Although, as we've talked before in this series, the faith that Star Wars calls us to have is a name it and claim it sort of a faith most of the time. Uh, but I do still think there's something there.
I mean, I was just reading A Canticle for Leibowitz, and towards the end of the book, they talk about how there's a secular character who, for him, pain is the ultimate evil, and relief of that pain is like the ultimate good. Then at that point, and um, so I think this does kind of show again some of the contrast with the Christian worldview, though, as well, because like suffering isn't necessarily like suffering is not good, but God can use suffering in ways that I feel like the Star Wars universe doesn't necessarily um, explore in the most deep sense, like because they're so scared of this fear, anger, hate, suffering pipeline um, that they end up, I mean, spoiler, turning Anakin onto that same pipeline.
Yeah, I think that's a good point about suffering, and it feeds into the Jedi's idea of detachment, which is not a Christian idea, at least not in the way that they go about it. In that, yes, as a Christian, we shouldn't become overly attached to changing fortunes, right? That's what Boethius really emphasizes, that we latch onto, we anchor identity in things that are eternal and things that are unchanging. But at the same time, we should love particular things in particular people. That's also very important to Christian understanding of like what it means to be human. Even Aristotle got this, that part of being a rational animal means that we're made to um, engage with language, which is why he says we're also the social or the political animal, that we are by nature meant to be in community with other people. And it's a very Christian idea, obviously. And so we have a way of viewing suffering in light of the eternal, Whereas the Jedi simply want to detach altogether, where they want to be like some of the worst forms of Stoicism. I think that there's a lot of good in Stoicism. The worst parts of Stoicism are like in the Manual of Epictetus, where he says that you should basically treat your family like they're already dead, so that way, if somebody comes and takes them, well, no big loss because you've already detached. It's like it's such a dehumanizing way to live. That's essentially what the Jedi do, right? That's why they forbid relationships. That's why they rip kids from their parents. And so I agree with you that they have a very unhealthy view of suffering. They don't have a redemptive view. They have an avoidance view of suffering, which I think is very dangerous. At the same time, I think that that progression that Yoda gives of fear leading ultimately to the dark side, I think that there's something to that. Reminded of this quote from George MacDonald in the Princess and the Goblin, where we're told that that's the way that fear serves us. It always sides with the thing that we are afraid of. And so, if we have some great fear of something, and in Anakin's case, child Anakin, I mean, I suppose it's the fear of loss. Well, that's actually going to end up pushing him into loss. Um, Whereas if we take the scriptural teaching and we have a fear of the Lord that drives us, right? Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Well, that's going to side us accordingly with the Lord. And so fear has a tendency of attaching you to that which you are afraid of. And so I think that part of what Yoda lays out there, actually, there is some genuine wisdom to be found in that, that in his fear of loss, he actually guarantees his loss.
And I think that there is evidence um, in this movie, in this text, that Qui-Gon kind of stands against that fully detached view of morality and the Force that Yoda exemplifies, because um, he's not concerned about Anakin's love for his mother. Of course, normally a Jedi would start before they even have conscious knowledge of their parents. Um, and he seems to be much more inclined to attach himself to people. He's very warm towards Obi-Wan. He's warm towards Jar Jar, who, is very annoying. There's just a sense that he is not concerned about attachment so much as obeying the will of the Force, um, which I would argue is a more Christian approach. Again, I am kind of importing some pieces from recent novels I've read, Master and Apprentice by Claudia Gray and The Living Force by John Jackson Miller. But I think the seeds of that are in Lucas's script.
Now, we've kind of talked around this a little bit. We've mentioned this before, even. What do you think is what makes Qui-Gon such an interesting figure, such a unique kind of Jedi? I've talked about this before, but I mean, would anyone else like to jump in here?
Ian brings up a good point of, trying to separate movie Qui-Gon from other source Qui-Gon, because I think it's very fun to flesh out who Qui-Gon is. And that is because he does allow for himself to experience certain things that I think truly dogmatic Jedi would view as attachments. Um, I keep going back to the Jedi Apprentice series, but basically you find out that Qui-Gon had kind of a love interest that um, gets killed. And it does send him for very brief time. And when I mean brief, I mean like a couple of days, right? But that would be anybody who would lose anybody. And yet it doesn't throw him completely to the dark side. He's able to rebound, or simply he's a mature adult and is able to deal rightly with his loss in a way that the Jedi are just like, we want nothing to do with that at all. And they don't really teach the Jedi how to deal with emotions in any way, shape, or form. That comes out a little more, in my opinion, in episode 2. But so because he allows himself to experience these other things, it allows him to see certain things coming that no other Jedi does. He senses that there is something bigger at play, that if he had survived episode one, I think you had to completely rewrite the rest of the prequel trilogy, because him, just the way he perceives the world and the living force and his emotions, he would have been able to see the manipulations a little better than everybody else. Although, Ian, Obi-Wan is the first person to say, I have a bad feeling about this, sensing that there's something bigger than their little trade dispute.
Yeah, that's because he's a paranoid weakling.
Here we go. Yeah.
Yep, back to the Obi-Wan hate.
No, but he does get called out for looking at the future and not being mindful of the present, I think, by Qui-Gon there, but he wasn't wrong about it. And Ian, you were talking about, and I assume, Ian, you didn't read the book before seeing the movie this time, right?
Not this time, though. It was
Okay.
in Attack of the Clones.
Okay. Wow. Well, I think Obi-Wan says to Qui-Gon, "Don't defy the council again," giving us the indication that like he has a pattern of being a bit of a maverick. So I do think that attitude is intended.
Yeah, and I think one of the most interesting things about Qui-Gon is, if you think about this as the first movie that we get after the original trilogy, this is the first time we've seen one of the old Jedi Order in his prime. Like, we see Obi-Wan and Yoda when they're old and reaching the end of their lives. And here we see Qui-Gon, this young, active Jedi master with an apprentice, like at the height of his powers, taking action, running, destroying battle droids, storming the bridge, doing all these things. Um, and then when we finally meet the other Jedi, besides Obi-Wan, who's his apprentice, we see the council, and they're really kind of stodgy. Like, Qui-Gon is cool. The council sits around in their chairs, and yes, we know Yoda is powerful and Samuel Jackson is a cool actor, but like in this movie, they don't really do anything but sit around in judgment, as contrasted to Qui-Gon, who's like, no, I'm going to do this. We need to be, taking action. He's out there, trying to at least make some small difference in the life of slaves, while the rest of the Jedi are content to sit in their temple on Coruscant. And I think that really does set him apart, even in this movie, from the other Jedi.
Right. And yeah, I think we're supposed to sympathize with him, but then at the same time, we know what is going to happen at the end, 5 movies later. We know how this is going to turn out. But, and they say that Anakin's too old. I really feel like that turns out to have definitely been true, because in the second and third movie, he's just kind of a brat who rejects authority and doesn't respect the wishes or the way things are done. And that is a part of what Palpatine is using to manipulate him into seeing the Jedi as the villains.
And I do want to say that Palpatine's plan here, I think, works a lot better than it does in the following two films. I think the following two films require too many of Palpatine opponents to ignore things that the audience, if they thought about, wouldn't ignore. Whereas this one, I feel like the call for the vote of no confidence, the manipulations of the elections, it all feels plausible to me in a way that doesn't require everyone to be dumb.
Yeah. We can come back to Palpatine's role. As far as what I think Qui-Gon principally provides here is that, while Anakin likewise is going to turn out to be a maverick of sorts, Anakin is a self-referential maverick, right? He does everything just based off his own impulses and desires. Whereas Qui-Gon, I mean, sometimes he'll skirt the Jedi code, he'll kind of do his own thing because he has a higher ethical standard that he's trying to attain to. And so in Qui-Gon, we really first clearly get this impression that the Jedi are not equivalent to the light side, that these are two different things, even if there's a natural relationship. Whereas from the original trilogy, I feel like we're left with the impression that like, the Jedi are the good guys in a story. I mean, maybe we have some reason. I mean, I know Ian may have some reason to question, the Jedi insights in the original trilogy, but at the same time, like they're clearly the good guys. Whereas with Qui-Gon, we see somebody who is trying to adhere to the light side, but in a way that actually prevents him from fully subscribing to the Jedi code. And I think that's important moving forward because now we see that like we're dealing with people here. We're dealing with the institution that whatever goodness is more of a transcendent kind of reality, which leaves us room to provide healthy criticisms of the Jedi without engaging in full-blown deconstructionism, if we're going to kind of dismantle some of that, which I think is somewhere where they go very wrong with the sequel trilogy, where they lose that contrast there, and I feel like they start to dismantle the very roots of the Jedi Order. But we can get more into that later on. But I think at this point they actually provide something very useful for maintaining fidelity to the good by giving us this character in Qui-Gon, allowing us to disentangle the institution from the ideal.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good point.
Maybe I should ask. So a lot of this movie and what comes after is built around this idea of the prophecy of bringing order to the Force, or bringing balance to the Force. I mean, now people will debate. Okay, what does that mean? What's your take? What does it mean to bring balance to the Force?
Well, I think the bad guys are non-existent. Like they none of them have seen they're shocked to hear that there might be a Sith Lord or something like that. Um, so yeah, if you know your math, on the one side of the equation you have tons of Jedi, and over here you might have two bad guys. So you're either going to be a lot more bad guys or a lot fewer good guys, it seems to me.
Well, that is I would argue, the Zen idea of balance, that light and dark must be equally represented. Um, and I think there's two Christian responses to that. One is that because of corruption, I would argue that the dark side has clouded the light side already greatly, regardless of the numbers. The fact that they separate children from their parents, the fact that they basically dehumanize people, the fact that they turn a blind eye to slavery in an entire region of the galaxy. Like, the dark side is strong in the prequels galaxy, so you could argue it's already at a balance. My preferred balance would be one that, and this is why I don't rely on George Lucas, because he says one thing and then like 10 years later he says a different thing. But at some point, George Lucas has said that the dark side itself is a perversion, similar to Augustine's idea that that sin is privation, an absence or an improper fixation on the light, on God. And that's what I prefer to think, is that the existence of the Sith and the fact that Palpatine has managed to maneuver himself into the Supreme Chancellorship means that the balance of the Force, the power of the dark side is so high that there needs to be a radical purge and reformation in those who follow the Force to restore balance. In that view, it's not about equal numbers. It's about, are people actually following the Force's will correctly?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as David said, that they're surprised to learn that there's a Sith presence, and so they think that everything seems to be going pretty well. And if in that state of thinking everything's going pretty well, you want someone to bring balance to the Force, that leads me to believe that this is something other than like, all right, somebody's gonna make the dark side get a little bit stronger. Like, I have to believe that in their minds, they're anticipating something a little bit more hopeful than that. In fact, even jumping forward a couple of movies, when Obi-Wan says to Anakin, you were supposed to destroy the Sith. Like that's his understanding of bringing balance to the Force, of actually eradicating evil, not joining them, which is why he's so confused at what's happening in that betrayal. And so I again, I don't know what Lucas was thinking. As Ian said, his thinking obviously changes over time. But as far as what has actually played out in the movie, I have to think that balance is more of this Augustinian idea of like balance is the good because the good is the only thing that has reality. And so I would say that, yeah, that's my understanding of balance. That would be synonymous with good, even as in we talked about in the original trilogy, that there wasn't a big focus on the light side of the Force. It was just you've got the Force, and then you have the dark side, the corruption. That this light versus dark kind of continues to grow, I think, throughout the franchise. But early on, it was just the Force, and then you have the corrupted use of the Force. And so I think that balance would just be the good, what we now tend to call the light side.
So the idea is that the Force, what do they call it? A vergence of the Force, that created Anakin for this purpose. I mean, if we're taking the Providence analogy to the logical conclusion, then all the events of these movies with culminating in Vader throwing the Emperor off the side, uh, and basically the eradication of this kind of bloated Jedi Order, that it seems that we're together that was the will of the Force, right?
That is a question I wanted to ask you guys for a bit in this conversation because you seem to be much more familiar with the lore of Star Wars outside of just the movies. How personal or directed is the Force revealed to be? Because there is one interpretation where you just say, well, yeah, everything that happens was the intention of the Force, which isn't really that exciting of an interpretation, but it is one way to read it, as far as I can tell. So, do you have any insights on how other creators or pieces of media in the Star Wars universe have dealt with that?
I mean, because Star Wars is such a multi-author project, there's several answers to that. One of them is in the Clone Wars animated show where Anakin and I think a couple other Jedi stumble on this planet that creates the Force through persons. And it's difficult to tell how literal that is and how much that um, is like a dream interpretation that Anakin has. Um, in general, I think it really depends. I think as Christians, our tendency is to want to read the Force as personal, as close to our idea of God as possible. And I think that is a legitimate reading of most of the text of Star Wars. However, there are a lot of atheist fans of Star Wars who will read the Force as basically, like gravity, an impersonal thing that we anthropomorphize. And I think that because of Lucas's inconsistency and the fact that a lot of Star Wars authors are atheists, that is also a legitimate reading of the Force. Just as a Zen Buddhist reading of the Force would also be legitimate because that is a direct influence on Lucas. So I think a lot of it is going to depend on what you bring to all of the source text. They refuse to, and I think wisely, given it's a huge franchise, refuse to nail it down to one thing in the text itself.
So George Lucas spoke, I can't remember if it was yesterday or the day before, and he tells this story of how when he was young, he asked his mother once, um, basically, how do we know God existed, basically? And she couldn't give him an answer. And so he, I guess, through a whole bunch of reading, came to the conclusion that nobody can explain who God is. He just knows that, like, he believes in something of a God. And so, much like the Greek gods were created to explain why things happen the way that they do in the world, he basically alludes to that, in a sense, Star Wars is kind of he doesn't directly say this, but he kind of alludes to the fact that Star Wars is kind of his own religion explanation of the world. And so I think because of that, whether he intended to or not, maybe he did, you kind of have to take certain parts of the Force as having some form of personality to it, right? And I think that could be found in the way that Obi-Wan in A New Hope explains, um, that it's in all of us, it penetrates, it flows through us. That's While that makes all of us one, that is also a very personal thing. And we as Christians, the way we interact with the Holy Spirit, the way we interact with the entirety of the Trinity, it is very a personal thing, and you can see that. You look at something like the Ahsoka season 1 show. You have this character who is considered the least force sensitive person ever. Like, they really hammer this home that she just has nothing of the force in her at all. And then, right at the exact moment the force needs her to, she has this ability to utilize this force push that throws a Jedi across this cavern, right? And so, in that moment, she is personally connecting with the force uh, to to do something. When we bring it now back to balance, yes, we can say in one interpretation of the Force that it was the will that all of the Jedi get wiped out because they just got too comfortable, basically. Now, you do see that with Yoda and with Mace, they do believe in the prophecy of the Chosen One and that they could be living in its fulfillment, but they never ask. There has been peace for over millennia. Why would the Chosen One need to show up in our time? Is it just to overthrow some darkness? Or could it be that we are a part of the problem and they never ask that question of themselves, or at least we're led to believe that they never ask that question of themselves. And to a certain extent, this brings back this phrase: "Hard time or tough times develop uh, tough people, which lead to good times. Good times leads to softer people." I am probably butchering that phrase, but you guys know what I'm talking about. And those are my comments.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to maintain like a secular or an atheistic understanding of what's happening in the Star Wars universe. In my reckoning, it comes down to, are we dealing with a Christian kind of metaphysic where we have a God, a central intelligence that has a will, that has some personality, that has active agency in this world, directing affairs? Or is it more like the God of Neoplatonism, which I won't lay out that whole system now, but to get right to the point of what we're talking about, the God of the Neoplatonists, which kind of similar to some elements of modern New Age, more or less. But this is where God is centrally focused on himself to the point where he's not actively concerned about what's happening in the world around us, but the world around us really just sort of emanates impersonally from the being of God. It's sort of a pantheistic sort of worldview where everything just emanates impersonally from God, and that's the context in which we find ourselves. And I feel like those are really the two primary ways of reading what the Force is in Star Wars. Does it have active intelligence that cares about us, or is it just sort of making things happening kind of just organically and unintentionally? Um, but as David was just talking about, this motif of the chosen one. I mean, it begs some questions like, chosen by what? Does that not imply some degree of agency that's doing the choosing? Or even this prophecy, which I don't know, maybe one of you can remind me, because if I've ever known, I've forgotten. Um, who gets this prophecy, and are we ever told like where it comes from, or is it just sort of vaguely thrown out there?
No, it's one of the biggest frustrations I have with all of Star Wars is we have no text, no provenance, and no ability to actually evaluate the prophecy itself. It's just vibes, and it makes me very frustrated.
Okay, so there's that. So we don't really know anything about this other than it's been said this is going to happen to somebody somehow. But even that idea of prophecy, like that implies somebody got some kind of message, which you get from an intelligence, right? Something capable of rationality. And so I feel like it's a more consistent reading to take the Force as something like active providence, something like God. I'm using like intentionally here because it's not the Christian God, but something like it, I think, is the most consistent way of understanding what it is.
Well, I was thinking about the scene with where at the end of the lightsaber duel with the double-bladed part when the force field separates Qui-Gon and Darth Maul. I've always thought that was a really cool picture of the difference between them because Qui-Gon just sits down, calms his mind. He knows the force field's going to open eventually, and Darth Maul is just pacing back and forth, hitting the force field with his lightsaber impatiently, waiting for that to go. And I don't know. I just thought that was an interesting picture without any words, trying to illustrate the difference in the attitude and the motivations of these two people.
Yeah, it's a good scene for building tension. I mean, the Duel of the Fates, which um, has some philosophical significance there. Of I haven't really spent a lot of time thinking about this, but I've heard it said that it has something to do with like the potential fates of Anakin, that they're fighting for a soul essentially. In fact, I very often see this like Facebook meme go around of like Qui-Gon and Darth Maul talking about, God and the devil are fighting for your soul. It's very Facebook theology meme stuff, but I've seen that going around from very, very well-intentioned people. But more unironically, that's definitely something that's at play, and I think that the music, the fight, it all captures that tension very, very, very powerfully.
Well, Judah just threw out there at the beginning of this that he thought there were plot holes in the original trilogy, and I wasn't going to just let that slide. And for me, I'm just joking, Judah, but for me, the only plot holes I see in the original trilogy were created by the prequel trilogy because again, I'd spent so much of my life wondering what another Star Wars movie would be like. And few of the things that we know that they had to work into this film were that Obi-Wan says that when he met Anakin, he was already a great pilot. So they had to work in the pod racing stuff and the flight, where he blows up the droid ship at the end to make that be true. They covered the part where Yoda says that Luke is too old and he's too reckless, and Obi-Wan says, "So was I, if you remember." I don't know how much we see Obi-Wan being reckless. The only real recklessness I see from Obi-Wan is um, like I think Daylon, it was you who said it, or no, maybe it was David. Anyway, at the end in the fight where he lets his anger kind of control him and he runs in there kind of rashly and ends up falling off the side. Um, but yeah, and then as we get into the other two movies, or particularly the third film, there's quite a bit of things that don't tie in with things that we learned in the original trilogy. And then of course, Darth Vader building C-3PO is just such such a weird thing. I'm sure y'all have seen the little two-panel thing that someone made in a comic of Darth Vader walking in to see C-3PO's parts in Cloud City and realizing that it's the droid that he'd built all those years ago. I thought that's cute, but yeah, it doesn't. You'd think you'd recognize R2 as well, but maybe all astromechs look alike. I don't know.
That is true. I guess I feel like I should explain myself a little bit more now. You're definitely right about this two trilogies creating plot holes with each other, particularly the prequel trilogy since it comes second. I was thinking more of plot holes within the narrative of each set of three movies. And with the originals, I think it's primarily just the result of Lucas not having the story figured out all the way uh, as he's making the movies, and that if he had just fleshed out the full story a little bit, there wouldn't have been as much of an issue. I think, just as an example, the way Leia is treated is probably the area where there's the biggest sort of inconsistencies. Like, if she's Vader's daughter, why does he not sense anything about her when they have clearly interacted multiple times, even before the opening scene of Episode 4? So that kind of thing. And then obviously there's the famous sort of relationship that Luke and her have. Call back to Tolkien, I guess, as a story that's similar to that. So anyway, those are the plot holes I was thinking of when I was talking about the original trilogy. With the prequel trilogy, my point was you can just tell that Lucas had a better idea of what he wanted to do with all three movies. Like in my recent skimming of The Phantom Menace, at the very end, you have Qui-Gon being cremated, which I thought was really interesting because that's kind of what happens to Anakin at the end of the third movie, spoiler alert. And I just thought that kind of parallelism or foreshadowing that Lucas brought in was really interesting and something I hadn't picked up on before. So it just has a little bit more unified threads through it. But yes, I totally agree with you that the prequels do definitely open up a whole bunch of questions about why things happen in the original trilogy the way that they do.
No, and that's fair, especially about Leia. Yeah, and Lucas admitted that he hadn't decided to make them sisters until he was way late into the game. But yeah, and the Qui-Gon funeral thing, we were all just left wondering why he didn't disappear. Not why his beard didn't catch on fire, which I always wondered that too. But why are they having to have a funeral for a Jedi? Why did he not disappear? And of course, we learn about that later on. Also, there's a funny thing. Um, the soundtrack for Episode One was released in stores on CDs like a few weeks before the movie actually came out, and one of the tracks on the CD was called "The Funeral of Qui-Gon Jinn," and it just ticked everybody off.
Yeah, back to my comment earlier about the Weird Al song that he was able to put together that entire song just from spoilers that he got here and there.
Right. Yeah, it came out like the same time as the movie. It was just ready to go and outline the entire plot perfectly.
Well, is there anything else from this movie that anyone wants to discuss that we have not brought up yet?
Uh, one thing, as to be a little fair to Lucas, it was his original plan, if I remember correctly, to get Lawrence Kasdan back to write the prequel films, or at least Episode One, and that fell through. He wanted, I think, Ron Howard, I want to say, was one director he talked to about directing Episode One. Maybe there was another director. So he ended up writing and directing these films, and he didn't want to. And so, to a certain extent, he was he, he rushed himself, but he was kind of rushed in putting these movies together. And I think that um, that certainly didn't help matters. And also much like he did with the original trilogy, but in a different way, he pushed movie making innovation, and I think Episode One holds up a lot better from a CG standpoint. Definitely better than Episode Two, but better than a whole lot of other movies that were being made around that time. So not only did he kind of start a movement, but he kind of did it pretty well.
Yeah, and the whole battle between the battle droids and the Gungans near the end, like there's no human actors in any of that, but it all feels like it's in the actual world. I do agree they did a pretty good job. He was too nervous to let them make Yoda CG, and maybe they weren't ready with the Yoda CG at the time, but I thought they did a good job. It's funny that to get Yoda right, you have to make your computer graphic look and act a little bit like a puppet, but they did a good job when they did that in episodes 2 and 3.
For some reason, the early 2000s, I guess, were kind of a heyday for epic movies that were taking advantage of the CGI technology, I guess, that had just finally gotten good enough to really make things that could be realistic and hold up in the long term.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. And, I don't really know anything about cinematography or CGI or anything, but just as a viewer, that is interesting that the movies from that era, like they look a lot better than a lot of things that are coming out today from Marvel or, like the Rings of Power with ridiculous budget poured into it. But the CGI is just awful compared to things that came out, 20, however many years ago. I
That's
don't really,
because
yeah.
that's because the budget goes into getting it done fast, whereas Lucas made sure he had lots of time to get his CGI and model work done right. That's why he did 3 years between each film.
Well, and I've heard that kind of that early 2000s time frame was the sweet spot of the technology developing enough to be able to do some of the cool things they could, but still have all the filmmakers with the experience of doing it the old way. So they still have those older skills that they can incorporate this new technology into. Whereas now everyone's grown up, just being able to, oh, you can CGI it, fix it in post-production, rather than taking the hard work and time to do it right.
I will say, as a young person, the first time I watched the original trilogy, it was actually mind blowing to see all the stuff that wasn't CGI. I'm like, wait, I have no idea how they did this. So just kind of coming full circle was kind of an interesting thing with special effects.
And I do like how they've kind of pulled it back a little bit, like with the sequel trilogy and The Mandalorian, there are a lot more practical effects. I mean, it's not that there are no special effects, but like in episode two, I know a lot of that they were just people in costumes in a complete green screened room, Samuel Jackson was saying, like, I was just told there's a big thing coming at you. And just, they'd swing the lightsaber around and they'd add some laser bolts bouncing off of them and stuff. So it must be difficult to act under those kinds of conditions when you don't have any kind of practical set or anything that you're dealing with. So yeah, I do like how they've brought it back down and reintroduced some of the old practical effects.
For The Mandalorian, it really made the show, since you mentioned that one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ewan McGregor said that after he finished the prequel trilogies, that he essentially wanted to take a break from Star Wars because of all of the green screen acting that he had to do, which, in my opinion, makes the Grievous fight even that much better. But yeah,
Yeah, it is a little dehumanizing. It is dehumanizing the more artificial things you have just imposed around you. It makes me think of if you look at some of the behind the scenes stuff of Ian McKellen filming in The Hobbit, where he's like having a breakdown because like this is like he was just everything was just digitally added into it, and he just did not feel like that's what he was supposed to be doing. Like he felt dehumanized, and I think that I do like that we're getting more of the practical effects. I mean, Mandalorian, that it's a lot slower. It's not nearly as flashy, which is part of what makes it so good. And I feel like it helps you to, I think, get back into character-driven stories when everything is more localized. It's not so much on the flashy effects of what's happening around you, but you're actually dealing with the characters at play. That being said, I think for the kind of story the prequels are telling, I mean, special effects they work, but I definitely like that we're starting to move away from that.
Yeah, that's a good point. In the prequel movies, I feel like the characters don't seem as interesting, but they are really supposed to be more of we're watching some people play their small part in these huge things that are happening. Whereas the original trilogy was about this ragtag group of people trying to rescue a princess for the most part of the film. And yeah, this with all the political intrigue, I mean, one of the characters is literally the somehow elected queen of a planet, the first and maybe only planet in Star Wars to have more than one biome on it, by the way. But uh, I never Ian, I don't know if they ever worked that out. I'm sure they do. I think they talk about it a little bit in episode 2, but it's too boring to watch more than once. The About how she was the queen, but she was democratically elected, and she was also a kid, and that's just how they do things on Naboo.
Yes, the novelization of Attack of the Clones does get into that.
It doesn't make sense.
I
Okay.
mean, it makes enough sense that it worked in my head.
Does it have to make sense though? It is, an alien world.
Yeah, we just don't understand the Nubian mind. Why they say Nubian? Nabooian seems better, but they say Nubian in the movie.
Because George Lucas isn't a linguist.
That is another thing. Um, Characters pronounce each other's names different ways all through the Star Wars movies, and I even have heard uh, Lucas in behind the scenes stuff before Episode 2 came out, pronouncing it Count Doku, which in Japanese, if you have two vowel sounds in a row, you would just say the long vowel longer. But I don't know if he's just like too embarrassed to correct people on set and it just became Dooku, and he just ran with it. But I just always thought that was odd.
Yeah. Also, I do have to mention, like, the stereotypes in this movie did not age well, where all the aliens are different stereotypes of um different people groups.
Right. Like the shrewd, um
Shrewd,
yeah,
cowardly Neomodians. The whole Gungan mess is just like, what are you trying to do with them?
right.
And
The
Um,
Watto.
and
Wait,
Watto.
whatever do you mean?
Right. And he's immune to mind tricks. He's such a shrewd businessman with his giant nose. Yeah, all of that is a little weird. And of course we have the Chinese Trade Federation, basically. Uh yeah, it is a little strange. And of course Harry Potter's had some of the same criticisms. But and like in our discussions, not in this podcast, but a related podcast on video games, the different races in Mass Effect also just kind of you just kind of encapsulate some specific aspect of human nature because that's of course the only nature that we truly know. And sometimes when you do that, it can end up looking like an old stereotype. But in this movie, some of them do seem a little on the nose.
The fact that they cast Korean actors for the Nemoidians, I think, means it was more than just an accident.
Right.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning, but I hate for that to be our, our ending point. Is there anything else anyone wants to throw out there?
I could throw something out about the politics of the plot since we haven't talked too much about that. I think this say that caveat this by saying we don't know, at least from the movie and what's in it, how much foresight Palpatine himself had. But what kind of struck me was if we just take it at face value, there was no guarantee that his plans would have succeeded. Like presumably, Palpatine would have expected Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan to be killed in like the opening scene when they're captured by the Trade Federation, but they're not. So politically speaking, he would have had to adapt his plans potentially quite a lot because of that. Unless he was able to foresee everything, then it's not a plot issue. But I just find it kind of fascinating that if he didn't have foresight to everything, it almost makes his political instincts even more impressive that he was able to be so adaptable to so many things that he didn't have control over, and still came out on top.
Yeah, and they're in the Senate, and he's whispering in Amidala's ears and just kind of shaping her view of the kind of political quagmire that they're watching. He's like, look, he's not gonna look at him. He's weak. They're not gonna follow him. Um, I forget his name. The guy played by Zod from the old Superman movie, Chancellor Valorum. Yeah. Uh, yeah, and I think that's really an interesting thing to think about because by Return of the Jedi, he's so overconfident. He just thinks everything that I am planning is just going to work out perfectly. And so he's just completely blindsided when Vader throws him over the railing because Yep. Once again, I'm just totally in control, and he loses it.
Yeah, and I feel like actually the Phantom Menace does a pretty decent job with setting up the political situation. And I think that there is some element of Palpatine foreseeing some things. And then I think it's just showing him as a very capable politician. Like he's able to see the adapting situation. Like I think originally he wanted them to capture the queen and force her to sign a treaty to make the invasion legal and build his power that way. But he sees an opportunity with the escape of the queen to then take over the Senate. Um, and I think that I think the movie actually does a decent job of building that political thing. I just wish it weren't in a Star Wars movie where I want more lightsaber fights.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting that the prequel movies definitely take a pro-democracy stance. Um, when jumping ahead a couple movies, we're fighting for democracy, like that's just outright said. Um, Yet, and we see exactly like Palpatine was democratically elected, and so I mean they don't really provide a positive example of the democracy that they're fighting for, really essentially anywhere. And so I don't really know how compelling that pro-democracy message is when we see exactly where it can lead. I mean, this is the problem that a number of the ancients had with the idea of democracy, that the problem is the people end up getting what they want. And why should we assume that the people know what they actually want or how to actually achieve what they want? And so we see a good example of where democracy tends to go exactly this to the kind of places that that Aristotle recognized that democracy tends to devolve into. So I don't really know what the meta political message to pull out of this is.
Well, we already, based on the original trilogy, decided that, Jedi means good, and because the Jedi support the Republic, therefore, Republic democracy equals good as well.
Yeah, unfortunately, you have to show that. And unfortunately, what's shown is a corrupt state which allows slavery in a massive chunk of territory with no interference whatsoever, and serves very nakedly corrupt politicians to amass their power rather than do good for people on planets.
Like, it was a different time, Ian. It was long, long ago.
That time ago.
If I were going to nerd out about things, I have innumerable questions about how the structure of the galaxy actually worked. Like, does Coruscant actually control everything? Why do all of these systems seem to have their own independent governments and then they come and go to the Galactic Senate? Is that more like a weaker form of central government, like the Articles of Confederation in the first or second Continental Congress or whatever that was? Like, there's a whole lot of potential political layers and structures that there's just not enough time to go into, and there would be even less time for lightsaber scenes. So, while it may be fascinating as someone to me who is interested in political systems and structures, you just can't really get into it in a 2-hour movie. So we are just left to speculate on how the government and the Galactic Republic actually worked.
I mean, I would assume it would have to be a fairly loose federation, unless the Republic had just a massive omnipresent military to sort of keep everything in order. I mean, it's like, colony across the ocean. We're talking about different planets that, obviously they have means of traveling quickly and communicating and all that. But I just, short of, well, a militaristic empire, like, I don't see how you hold it together in a really centralized kind of way.
Yeah, maybe Qui-Gon couldn't come there with the intent of freeing slaves in the name of the Jedi Order because they gotta respect planet's rights or something like that. But again, we're not told.
Yeah, if we get into Attack of the Clones, and I mean the Clone Wars show gets into it a bit more. I mean, we see some of the Galactic Senate in Andor. I mean, that's under the Empire, but we still see some of the ways that that works out. And I think there's a lot of bones of things that could be interesting there that we just don't have great execution on.
Well, I think that unless anyone else has anything of dying importance to share, I honestly, I keep saying this with different things we're doing, different shows. I'm impressed with where we've gone, given the source material. Many of us started off saying we don't really know where we're going to go philosophically with this, but I think we hit some worthwhile points of conversation. Look forward to seeing where things move forward. Although I know episode 2 tends to not be on people's top list, but we'll see. Maybe we can redeem that as well. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap it there. Thanks, everyone, and I will see you next time. All right. Thank you for listening or watching if you're over on YouTube. We will return again with the Attack of the Clones in a couple weeks, but as you wait, there is plenty of Mythic Mind content to engage with. You can head over to the main Mythic Mind podcast, where we're cycling through a few different things at once here. We're doing a book club on Augustin's Confessions that I'm posting over there. I'm releasing material from my Fiction and Philosophy of C.S. Lewis course. I'm currently on the Ransom series, or the so-called Space Trilogy. And then, of course, sometimes we do other things over there as well. And then also over on the Mythic Mind Games podcast, we're taking a Christian humanities approach to video games. And right now we're in the midst of a Mass Effect series. So there's plenty of Mythic Mind stuff to engage with. And if you want to get access to all of that early and ad-free delivered through a single feed, then become a patron over on patreon.com/mythicmind. That also gives you full access to our Discord server, to some of our other patron platforms, and also gives you open invitations to all of these shows. So whether you want to become actively involved, you want to get that podcasting perk, or you just want to support us, then I welcome you to join us over on patreon.com/mythicmind. And if you're listening to this shortly after it comes out, know that next week our course begins on Plato's Stoicism Until We Have Faces. And so to enroll in that, you can head over to patreon.com/mythicmind and check out the shop, where you can buy the course directly, or you can become a tier 3 patron and get access as well. And in either case, you'll have indefinite access to this course, even if it's over. And so if you don't have time to track with us in real time, then you're more than welcome to go back and participate by watching the videos as you do the reading. All right, well, that's it for now. See you again here in a couple weeks, although the next thing to come out from Mythic Mind will be, I guess, next Monday, August the 3rd, over on the main Mythic Mind podcast. But that's it for now. Until next time, Godspeed. Plato's Stoicism Until We Have Faces, an 8-week course beginning in August 2025, led by Dr. Andrew Snyder. I have always, at least ever since I can remember, had a kind of longing for death. It was when I was happiest that I longed most. It was on happy days when we were up in the hills, the three of us, with the wind and the sunshine, where you couldn't see Gloam or the palace. Do you remember? The color and the smell, and looking across at the gray mountain in the distance. And because it was so beautiful, it set me longing, always longing. Somewhere else there must be more of it. Everything seemed to be saying, "Psyche, come." But I couldn't come, and I didn't know where I was to come to. It almost hurt me. I felt like a bird in a cage when the other birds of its kind are flying home. And now I will make answer to you, O my judges, and show that he who has lived as a true philosopher has reason to be of good cheer when he is about to die, and that after death he may hope to receive the greatest good in the other world. For I deem that the true disciple of philosophy is likely to be misunderstood by other men. They do not perceive that he is ever pursuing death and dying. And if this is true, why, having had the desire of death all his life long, should he regret the arrival of that which he has always been pursuing and desiring? The longing of Plato and the control of the Stoics pervades Lewis's retelling of the Cupid and Psyche myth Until We Have Faces. With this incredible novel, which he believed to be his best, Lewis demonstrates the tensions in ancient thought and, even more significantly, the limits of rational philosophy, which can only go as deep as the foxes can dig. Beyond that, under that, and providing the life of that thought, we find the dark and holy places that blind our faculties of reason. What then shall we do? This is a topic that we will explore after first surveying some important philosophical contributions in the ancient world that have had some significant bearing on Lewis's great novel. To this end, we will begin with Plato's Phaedo, which discusses the immortality of the soul and what those who love wisdom might expect in the life to come. And then we'll spend 4 weeks with some of the great Stoics, including Epictetus, Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca. Finally, we will turn our attention to Till We Have Faces for the final 2 weeks with original content, and so this will not be the same as what you may have seen in the Fiction and Philosophy of C.S. Lewis course. Each week of this 8-week study will include readings from primary sources that will be provided as PDFs, although these are all texts that belong in your personal library. You'll be provided with recommendations for secondary readings, you'll have recorded presentations for you to watch at your leisure, ongoing Discord chats, and weekly live meetings to discuss the readings. Enroll today by going to patreon.com/mythicmind and checking out the shop, or you can gain access to all courses, past, present, and future this year by purchasing a Tier 3 annual subscription. I hope to see you there.